Yes, Top Coup is tier 0, but I think it's important to understand what goes beyond Top Coup. Hey everybody, Espira, and today we're actually going to be finally breaking down a meta tier list for FB02 Blazing Aura. I always try to hold off until we have some tournament data, as well as a few weeks of play to fully understand what the impact of certain cards are, the impact of certain decks, before kind of breaking down a meta tier list and saying like, hey, this is what you're going to look forward to. I think there's value in the prediction lists, and kudos to the other content creators who went ahead and did that, but for my sake, I kind of rather just say, hey, now that we understand the world a little bit better, where does everything line up? Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are unequivocally in a tier 0 format currently. When we look at the tournament data, it is so abundantly clear that Top Coup is not only defining population size of the tournament, it is dominating Top Cut to a point where it is consistently at over 50%, and in some tournaments over 60% of Top Cup coverage. And then the other majority share is taken up by like Beerus, which is the other red deck. And if you actually look at the deck lists, they're essentially just mimics of Top Coup himself, just not doing it as consistently. At the end of the day, realistically, you're playing the top package, and if you want to do it the best, you are playing Top Coup. The biggest things is that Top Coup is really good at excelling in almost every facet of the game. It's extremely consistent, it's explosive, it has a ton of versatility in like for free versatility, because a lot of the bodies you play anyways are very toolboxy in terms of what they remove and what they can do. And then finally, it has a lot of sustain. It gets a lot of recursion with things like glimpse and the ability to be able to keep drawing cards, even though it's deploying body over body over body. At the end of the day, it is able to play a really powerful aggressive game using his ability and pumping out Keflas really early, and it can even slow it down against the slower decks, especially as we're seeing blue kind of take front stage as a deck that's not really countering Top Coup, but giving it a little bit of counterplay. So in that regard, it's just Top Coup is the entire package. The only thing that's like really a weakness is that it doesn't go incredibly tall, which sometimes can be punished with things like a Beerus board wipe or something like that, or a Zeno. But at the end of the day, a Top Coup player that knows that that's coming, it can position their board in a way to still apply pressure, but not totally lose out to a board wipe, and then just kind of rebuild their board afterwards, which they can do for extremely free. And that's on top of the fact that if you're at 2 life, they have a 1 energy hand check, which can force out game incredibly consistently when you tie that with Glimpse and a bunch of the other combo cards in the deck. If you're looking for a deeper dive and breakdown into all of my decisions with this tier list, I actually go over it in my exclusive Patreon articles, alongside a prediction tier list of what I expect the meta to be if Top Coup gets dealt with in some way, shape, or form in the coming weeks. So you're definitely going to want to check that out if you want to level up your gameplay. At the end of the day, I'm not telling you guys something you don't already know, whether it's tournament play or ladder play. Top Coup is clearly at the top of the game. And it kind of explains why when we go into A tier, and I want to be very specific, Top Coup is 100% tier 0. A tier is more so a deck that has positioned itself in a place to sometimes being able to contest wins over Top Coup, not in a consistent fashion, but at least play games against it. And Beerus is the deck so far that's done it the best. In tournament top cuts, we have seen that Beerus has taken up 3 to 4 slots depending on the tournament, which is pretty good. But again, when you dig into the deck list, turns out they're just Top Coup, but the leader has a removal ability. It's slower, it's not as consistent, and I would argue is actually way worse against a lot of the blue decks that are coming up and propping themselves to face against Top Coup. I think Beerus is only as good as he is here on this tier list, specifically because of the way that he interacts with Top Coup. And if Top Coup were to get dethroned in some fashion, I do actually think Beerus goes down quite a bit of a notch, because it actually just doesn't sustain as well being a crit leader and not being as explosive against the things like the blue and green deck that would potentially take the place of top of the meta. We've got Top Coup at the top, and then we have like impersonation at Top Coup over in the A tier. And then this is kind of where I'll lump in the blue decks as well. I think the blue decks have shown their ability to really hold off Top Coup and push into a late game where maybe a Top Coup player plays to gas themselves out and put themselves in a position where they can lose on the crackback. And this is mostly on the back of a lot of blues infinite recursion, things like Galagun, things like Peel Off, and things like Vegeta and Scythe to help clean up the board. But at the end of the day, it's not really any specific leader, and that's kind of why I'm grouping them all here. Regardless of your leader choice, you can have decent amount of success in the matchups just based off of your blue cards and never having to awaken. To that end, I think there's actually value in Trunks and Vegeta being more valuable than Zamasu, because they actually don't mind awakening. But very much, you could play almost the entirety of a game against, say, a Top Coup player being on your unawakened side and still being able to push out on turns 6, 7, and 8 because of the infinite recursion that blue provides. So it's not so much the leaders as it really just is blue's toolkit allowing you to be able to sustain early, sustain late, and things like Zeno allow you to recoup on board and maybe make a game for yourself. It doesn't really give you a winning matchup. Some players will say that it typically does, but I think top coup players can definitely adjust to play a slower game, be more methodical with the way they use their glimpses, and actually still end up being able to get there. So at the end of the day, if you don't even play perfectly, you know, a top coup player just has to play mediocrely and just find a good in to be able to close out the game, and they still get there. Now, when I say blue decks, I mean all the blue leaders that are able to actually draw cards on their unawakened side. When we're talking about Goku Black, it's a shame because I do like a lot of the tools that Goku Black got, but I actually think they positions himself more so in C tier as specific to this meta. He doesn't respond really well to the things that top coup is doing, and can have a level of inconsistency that's not amazing because of his crit side. Means that he can't play a slow game really because he doesn't see any cards. You can crit top coup, but you're still just kind of helping them awaken on that front, and then you're, you know, susceptible to crack packs and stuff. I think Goku Black's got some really cool mid-range plays now, and I do like the deck so much more with the new support that it got in set 2. But unfortunately, in the face of what top coup is, I don't think it's positioned all incredibly well. So if we're looking at tier 0, we got top coup. Tier A, or I don't even like calling it A because it makes it sound like it's closer than it is. We can call it B, but we'll just leave it A for now. Are decks that are positioning themselves to at least have a game against top coup. Then when we're looking at B, we're looking at decks that either can hedge certain matchups if they are or not facing top coup, or they themselves can position themselves to have good games because of the tools that they have available. The red decks kind of do what De Beers does, but worse in the face of being essentially just TOP decks. Unfortunately, when it comes to U7 coup, you're running a lot of non-U7s, which means your pump doesn't happen on everything, even though you still have some good targets like a 3-drop Gohan that becomes a 30k attacker, which is pretty good. At the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that you're not getting that bonus for. And then on Stardoku's side, we're no longer in a meta where 1-for-1 is king. You're now in a position where you really need to be 2-for-1ing or 3-for-1ing your opponent to put yourself in a position to win, especially since, you know, top coup and other similar decks are deploying 3 to 4 threats every single turn. So in that regard, having the 1-for-1, especially since a lot of your opponents are just going to be using hard removal anyways, doesn't position yourself really great and leaves a deck to not be in a fantastic position, but it's still a deck that can play a game because it's still a red deck that can play the Kefla package and can still pose some decent threats. It just doesn't have a ton of advantages over what anything else is doing. And from here is actually where we're going to be looking at a few of the green decks, which I actually like quite a bit. Here, Androids and Cell, I'll be positioning in the B tier. And these are decks that can excel at utilizing multiple Cell 8s to push into the late game. Androids are like really, really good, oddly enough, at being able to get to 10, 11 energy. And because they're so good at doing that, it means that they can actually use a Cell 8 and not lose so much energy that they can't just hard do it the next turn afterwards. And of course, when it comes to Cell himself, you have Cell Games Arena and the leader ability allowing you to loop A drops. It's not super consistent. Red decks are going to be able to get there, but if you're able to line up your matchup against any of the other decks that are trying to do their thing, if you're trying to play against Beerus, it's not fast enough, even though it is a TOP Kefla deck, then you can be in a position to really give the deck a very, very hard time. And I do have to state, I think green is incredibly powerful and does some really degenerate things. So in a world where top coup isn't top of the game, I actually do really see green being in a very scary spot in terms of positioning itself as potentially the best decks of the format once again. Rounding out C tier, they're not bad strategies. They're just strategies, unfortunately, that fold to what the meta is trying to do, and then the decks that are trying to put up a game against what the meta is trying to do. Frieza specifically, yellow has always had a iffy matchup into red because a lot of their removal is super free, as well as applying a bunch of tempo. Now they're able to establish boards out of nothing. They're able to get multiple attackers. And on the flip side, you've got the blue matchups, which are now miserable because you have things like 3-cost Vegeta and Scythe that, you know, never really felt good for yellow in the first place. But now it's like, yeah, you could stun 3-cost Vegeta, but his permanent's still going to be live, meaning that your 5-costs and whatnot are still vulnerable. In that regard, it is really tough to be a yellow deck right now because it just feels like you got a lot of the tools to deal with green decks, which, you know, forever in a green meta, it's not terrible, but unfortunately didn't really get ton in terms of defending itself against red and got significantly worse against blue. So in the face of the current meta, it's not in a great position. In a world where top coup gets hit, maybe looking a little bit better, but it's just not great. Although I do like the ability to be able to attack with coolers, which helps you control the 2-drop game. And cooler can be something really annoying for top coup if they don't find something like a God Kamehameha or string of multiple attacks to be able to do something against it. So I don't hate Frieza. I think there are some things it can do to make the game really annoying, but I don't think it's well positioned. And to that same sense, I mean, we have Broly. Broly, really the only successful builds I've seen are ones that can do something like a double bean, putting you at a 35k lead. And at that point, it is really hard to hit, or just a single bean putting you at 30 as well. So Bean Broly is one of those things that can kind of give you a little bit of sustain. But again, you're putting yourself in a position where it is really easy for top Ku to put you at 2 life, and then you're on like just constant fear of losing out the game. You're a green deck that gets some free ramp, which means sometimes if your opponent's not careful, they can lose to something like an Android 17 and 18 double strike or something like that, or a Broly that they're not able to defend. It's not amazing, but it's something the deck can do. But again, not super well positioned. Being a green deck is incredibly tough in this format, and the only reason I think Android 17 and 18 can get away with it is because they have a bunch of floating energy on their turn because of the way that a lot of their ramp works now with the 4-drop twins, or the fact that, you know, if your top Ku opponent fumbles for 1 turn, that 1 turn is all Cell really needs to be able to get into his late game, whereas Broly doesn't really have any of those benefits. Going into D tier, these are strategies that just don't really get there. They don't spin themselves well against tier 0, and they don't really spin themselves well against anything else in the format, really. They're not bad strategies. They play good cards. They play solid strats. They just are not positioned in a way to succeed in the meta. Primarily here, we're talking about Cooler. Crit leaders just have a really hard time, especially since you're not seeing the cards you need. But sometimes Cooler can get there because, hey, maybe you're able to swing 240Ks at your opponent's leader and that was enough and they weren't able to crack back in time, and then you can just kind of close out, right? Not amazing, but it's something. Same thing with Vegeta. I like Vegeta a lot in terms of a deck, but it is really tough to be able to deal with both red and blue, especially with the ways that they control the board. I think there are ways to be able to get there. I think there are ways you can play the game for sure, but I don't think they lean to the strengths of what yellow really wants to do. And then Gohan kind of fits in here as well. Not having the 25k body means that it needs to work even harder to be able to get there. You can utilize things like 3-cost Trunks blocker. It has become a little bit better this format because it's not as easy for red to kind of work around it because it negs by like 15k's ballpark, but it can still get there. But nevertheless, it has a couple of tools that can make the game bearable, but it's not great. And then finally, to close it out, we've got F, which is essentially the consistent Ginyu tier. At the end of the day, the strategy just leans on bodies that are really, really fragile. And sure, there's a world in which maybe if your opponent's really not paying attention, they can get cracked back and be in for a hurting, but it's really hard as Ginyu to establish a board for a turn and then go for like, you know, DK style thing that you're going afterwards. And anything that you're going to try to play as Ginyu to be a little bit more mid-rangey is just better positioned to do as Frieza instead. At the end of the day, it's a tier 0 format. There's not much to say about that. Everything warps around how top Ku plays, but I do think in a world where top Ku gets dealt with, we're dealing with a very interesting meta. With that said, everyone's got their opinions. Maybe my list is wrong. You guys let me know in the comments down below what you guys think, and I'll catch you guys on our next one.